Okay, so we are on the top of that Nun Vav Amar Aleph, but I think it's worthwhile so that we don't lose the continuity of the sugya that we go um, back a little bit to Daf Nun Teyam Beis. Now, the Gemara introduced that there was a Mishnah Rishona, which is our Mishnah, and there was a Mishnah Acharona. And there are two differences in Psak Halacha between the Mishnah Rishona and the Mishnah Acharona. The first difference, which is the focus of our Gemara, is whether or not the yayin or the juice becomes yayin as soon as it starts to flow out of the grapes. Our Mishnah held it doesn't, and therefore our Mishnah held that you could be doirech in a gas together with a goy, because while the wine is in the gas, while the wine is in the gas, even though there's wine there and the wine is flowing, it's not classified halachically as wine, and therefore it cannot become yain esach. However, in the Mishnah Acharona, they said that once the wine begins to flow, it is considered wine, and therefore you're no longer allowed to be doirech begas. But there was another difference that we discovered between the Mishnah Rishona and the Mishnah Acharona, where the Mishnah Acharona is actually meko over the Mishnah Rishona, and that is whether or not there's a prohibition to be metama Paris of Eretz Yisrael that are Paris of Chulin. The Mishnah Rishona held you were not allowed to, and therefore our Mishnah Rishona says that Yisrael shehu oiseh betuma loy darchen v'loy boitrin imay, but with a goy you would be allowed to. So a goy that was metama Paris, you'd be allowed to work with him. But a yid you wouldn't be allowed to work with because it's misayeya lidei over avera. However, in the Mishnah Acharona, we said that the set of halachas that are relevant are dabav, the dalad beis, and that is ein darchen ima oivit gechavim begas. That was mishum d'rafuna, and that was the subject of our sugya, where the Mishnah Rishona held that even though the wine is flowing in the gas, it doesn't become yain until it's in the bar. But the Mishnah Acharona paskins that it becomes yain right away as soon as it begins to flow. And then the other difference was vein boitrim Yisrael she'osav perosav betuma. That's universal. Sign the Mishnah Rishona, sign the Mishnah Acharona, because if you're being boitrim with a Yisrael, you're taking the pears off the tree and you're putting it into a gas that's tameh. You are being metame pears of. You are being metame pears. Now, this is not due to the same reason as it was in the Mishnah Rishona. In the Mishnah Rishona, the reason why this was also is because you're being metame pears. But in the Mishnah Acharona, it will not be also, and we're going to get to in a moment. In the Mishnah Rishona, you were not allowed to be boitzer ima ovid kechavim begas because you're making pears tamei. But here in the Mishnah Acharona, you are allowed to be boitzer ima ovid kechavim begas, meaning you are literally taking pears of Eretz Yisrael that are Torah, and you're being metame them by placing them into the gas. And the reason why you're allowed to do that is because the Mishnah Acharona argues and says shemuter ligrem tuma l'chulin shebe'eretz Yisrael. You are allowed to make pears of Eretz Yisrael that are chulin. You're allowed to make them tamei. So if that's the case, we need to understand why in the Mishnah Acharona did they not allow you to be boitzer with Yisrael shoysa perosav betuma. If you're allowed to make pears of Eretz Yisrael tamei, so why, if you could be boitzer with a goy and you could be goyim that the pears should become tamei, why can't you do the same thing with the Yisrael? So Rashi tells us the teretz is because the tevel of a Yisrael is chulin u'truma mi'urav and zevazeh, and we know truma you're not allowed to make it tamei. Truma has to be protected, and since every tevel has truma in it, you're not allowed to allow the tevel to become tamei. But the produce of a goy is not tevel. The produce of a goy does not have a chi of trumas and and therefore you could be boitzer with the goy, but you cannot be boitzer with the Yisrael. Now let's go to the next section of the Gemara, which explains the next section of the Mishnah. The Einoi Oisa Yayin Nesach Ad Sheyered Labar. The Yayin does not become Yayin Nesach until it goes into the bar, and our Mishnah says that it doesn't become Yayin until it goes into the bar. Frag to Gemara Vatanya, we have a brisa that says that even after the Yayin goes into the bar, it still doesn't become Yayin. Rather, it's not considered Yayin until it's Misha Yikfe, until a process occurs as the wine is sitting there settled in the bar, where the psoila starts to rise up to the top, and then you could skim the top off to take away the impurities. So that's at a later stage than just the wine settling in the bar. It actually is there for a little while, where the psoila starts to rise to the top. So this is a kula, because this says that it won't become yayin nesach. It cannot become yayin nesach until a little bit later. Amarava. Now, it's important to point out that this brisa that says yayin misha yikva is not discussing yayin nesach. What it is discussing is at what time, at what point does wine considered a gemar malacha le'inyan the chiyuv of trumas and maasros. We know that when your pears are raw in the field, there's no gemar malacha on them yet. There's not yet a trigger to make them into tevel to be mechayiv with trumas and maasros. So the question of this brisa is, at what point in the processing of the grapes does it become considered nigmar malacha, and now you're mechuyev to separate trumas and maasros? And the answer to that was yayin misha yikve. Now the Gemara is assuming that there wouldn't be a difference in between gemar malacha of yayin lagabe yayin nesach and the gemar malacha of yayin lagabe the chiyuv truma. So therefore, we have a kasha. Rava says loy kasha hara bekiva harabanan. In fact, even in the Mishnah Rishona, there was a machlokes as to when the gemar malacha of the wine is. The Tanan we learned yayin mishayered labar. That's the Tanakama, which is consistent with our Mishnah. But Rabbi Kiva was mekel. Rabbi Kiva and Mishayikfe. It's a little bit at a later stage. Once it's settled in the bar for a little while, and now the shemorim rise to the top, that can be skimmed off. So this machlokes is in fact seen in the brayso that says Yain Mishayikfe. Because Yain Mishayikfe is going according to Rabbi Kiva. Ibayalu. So the Gemara wants to understand a little bit more deep what is Rabbi Kiva's shita of Mishayikfe. Because in fact, this process of wine sitting, the psoilus rises to the top, that actually happens two times. It happens when the wine first goes into the bar, but then they take the wine from the bar and they bottle it, they put it into jugs. And then in the jugs, this same thing happens again. A finer layer of psoilus rises to the top that can now be skimmed off. So the Gemara Shaila is that Rabbi Kiva says, Misha Yikve is the Gemara Malacha for wine. Is that kifui the bar? Is that the earlier kifui that occurs inside the bar? Or maybe a kifui the chavis, or maybe he's referring to the second time the psoilus rises to the top, which is once it's put into the barrel, which is a much later stage in the game. That was the shayla. Tashma, the Gemara brings a raya. The Tanya Yain Misha Yikve. Yain becomes Nigmar Malacha when the psoilus rises to the top. That's the shita of Rabbi Kiva. And the brayso continues. Af al pi shekafa, even though this has occurred, kaileit min hagas el yoina. You're still allowed to take wine out of the gas above the bar. Umin atzinar, and the wine that's flowing down from the gas into the bar. If you put a cup there, you can catch the stream coming from the gas. The shoysen you're allowed to drink. Clearly, we're speaking about a beis habad, and we're talking about wine going into the bar. So shmamina hifui the bar kalminon shmamina. So now we know clearly that Rabbi Kiva shita Misha Yikve is the first Misha Yikve while it's in the bar, not a later stage which occurs when it's in the chavis. Break the Gemara. It seems like we have a third shita as well, because the Atani Rab Zvid, the Devei Rab Oishia, Yayin Mishayered Labor V'Yikve, and Rabbi Kiva Omer, a third period of time, Mishayishla B'Chaviyos, when they're poured into the Chaviyos. So now we have three timings. We have the timing of our Mishnah as Mishayered Labor. Then we have the timing of the Tamakam of this brisa we just quoted, which is Misha Yikve. And now we have a third shita, which is Rabbi Kiva quoted in the brisa as Misha Yishla B'Chaviyos. Zok to Gemara, Tirtza Nami Lahach Kamaisa Hachi. This is how you should explain the earlier brisa. Yayin Misha Yered Labor V'Yikve. So if you go back to the brisa of Rabbi Kiva Rabbanon, Yayin Mishayered Labar, that means V'Yikve. And Rabbi Kiva Omer Misha Yishla. So change the brisa, but it's really only one shita. So Tirtalach Kamaisa Hachi Yayin Mishayered Labar V'Yikve, and Rabbi Kiva Omer Misha Yishla B'Chavi. Frank the Gemara, but we're still going to have three shitas, because now you're explaining the earlier Mishnah that we quoted in the Mesecha of Negay to Trumas Amaisris, Negay to Gemara Malachal in Trumas Amaisris. We had two scenarios: either Mishayered Labar V'Yikve or Misha Yishla. But our Mishnah still has a third period of time, the earliest period of time, and that is merely Mishayered Labar. So, Frank the Gemara Belamasnizin the Katani Einoisa Yainesa Achiyered Labar Lema Klaza Tanoi. Are you going to say that there's a three-way machlokes as to when the wine is nigmar melacha, both for the purposes of yain nesach as well as for the purposes of making a tevel and involving the chiv tumas hamaisrus? Maybe we could change everything, and we could say you cannot ask me a kasha at all from the brisa of Mishir Lebar Mishayikve, because shiny yain nesach dachmiru be'eraban. Yain nesach is much more chomer, and it will become wine at an earlier stage. So yes, we do have three possibilities. We have plain Mishayered Labar, we have Mishayered Labar V'Yikve, and we have Mishayishla L'Chaviyos. But not all of these three timings, triggers, happen or are relevant both by Meiser, by making a tevel, as well as Yain Nesach. Because by Yain Nesach, it's one of two earlier stages. It's either Mishayered Labar, or maybe it's Mishayered Labar V'Yikve. But nobody holds it's Mishayishla B'Chaviyos. And that's like Abba Yain Nesach, which is a much more Chomer D'Keinin, the question of Zara, V'Surano. However, when the question of when is the Gemar Malacha, Lagavi Trumas and Maisers, for that, nobody holds it's such an early stage of when it just goes into the bar. The earliest shears, when it goes into the bar and the toilet starts to separate, and the later stage is Mishayishla. So therefore, once we disengage our sugya of Yain Nesach from the sugya of Gemar Malacha for Trumas and Maisers, we don't have a kasha. Zok to Gemara, if you look at the beginning of our Gemara, where our Gemara asked the kasha from Trumas and Maisers, from Gemar Malacha Trumas and Maisers to our sugya, Rava didn't say, hey, you can't bring me such a raya, like we're concluding now. Rava took the kasha seriously and had to create a machlokes Rabbi Kiva and Rabbanan. So Rava clearly disagrees with you. Rava clearly holds you can easily compare Yain Nesach to Tevel for Trumas and Maisers. So Frank the Gemara Ula Rava, turning on to Amud Beis. Ula Rava, the loy shiny lay. So he does have three shitas. He'll have to say there's actually a three-way machlokes as to when the Gemar Malach is. Beautiful. Zok to Gemara. Ma shebebar oser ba'ashar muter. You have wine flowing down into the bar. Whatever is in the bar will be oser. That's wine. And if the guy touches it, it's tam yain. And it'll be oser ba'no. But bashar, anything above the bar, will be muter. Amar Afuna, Zok Rafuna, Loi Shanu Ella Shaloi Hichzir Gargusni Legas. There was an extra filtration that they had as the wine was pouring down from the gas into the bar. they actually had a basket that was it acted like a strainer. So the flow of wine would go into the basket. The basket would withhold some pieces and shemarim, and then the wine would drain down into the bar. So Zogt Rav Huna, the only time we say that Masha Begas is mutter in the Mishnah Rishona, that's if you didn't take that basket that was straining the wine and you placed it into the gas. If you didn't do that. But if you put the gargosni into the gas, the wine in the gargosni is osir, and it will now osir the wine in the gas. Why is the wine in the gargosni osir? Didn't we say that it doesn't become wine until it gets into the bar? The gargosni is before it gets into the bar, it's suspended above the bar, and it's just allowing the kiluach, the stream of water, of wine, to run through it. So gargosni, gufa b'mai kabitzera. Why is it osir? Benitzuk? Are you telling me it's osir because after the wine goes through the strainer, it drips down or it flows down into the bar? So there's a steady flow of wine from this basket down into the bar, so that connects them, and that's why the wine in the basket will be osir. So shemamina nitzuk chibur. Kum techois, we had a shaila, the Gemara has a shaila later on, if the fact that there's a flow in between, a stream in between, does that connect them? And you're telling me that you're assuming that it connects them, and that's why the wine that's in the basket becomes osir. Zot Gemara, no, we're not saying that at all. So if that's not the case, from where does this wine in this gargusni become osir? Zot Gemara, Kedutani Rab Chia shepichsasai tzeluchisai. Rab Chia once said that you can have this basket that's low enough that it's below the surface of the wine in the jug. Hachanami shepichsasai bayra. Here we'll say that the level of wine in the bar was so high, and the basket was hanging so low that the bottom of the basket was actually sitting in the bar. So now there's wine from the bar in the basket, which means there's wine that's yain nesach in the basket. Now, if you take that basket and put it in the gas, you're going to aser everything in the gas. One of the questions that we're going to have here is, I don't understand. If nitzuk is chibur, and that's why the gargusni is aser, well, the same nitzuk that's going from the basket, from the strainer down to the bar, is going from the gas into the strainer. So why doesn't it become aser? Because there's one nitzuk joining the bar back up into the gas. So let's have a little peek at Tosfos and see what Tosfos says. There's a lot of Tosfos on this plot, and the reason why there's so much raid on this plot is because this was very negate to Yeridea. Yidden made wine, Yidden had Goyish workers, Yidden bought wine from Goyim, Yidden sold wine to Goyim. So there are so many shilas, and this Gemara is the epicenter of where we know the halachas from. So let's have a quick look at some of the Tosfos, and just to get a little bit of an insight into what was going on over here. Avalam hichter gergusni lagas osir. Pirish, af masha begas. Even the wine in the gas would be osir. You know why? Mipnei tipos yain shebegargusni hamisar begas. Because there's wine in the gargusni that we're saying becomes osir. Once you put that into the gas, it osers the wine in the gas. The imtaimar. Correct Tosfos, I don't understand. How much wine already is there left over in a strainer? Very little. V'aloi mistame yesh begas Yosy mishishim mitipas yain hagargusni. It's zicher bottle b'shishim. V'amrina lekamon beperek beis chamer chadeta ve'invei rabba amar b'noisen tam. Now, if it's bottle b'shishim, it's not noisen tam. V'kaim alon kerava legabe abaye. And we hold like Rav Lagabe Abaye that it would be benoisen tam. V'chitema kivin the begas nami ika yain imha novim v'havale min b'minoi. If you're going to tell me that since in the gas there's some wine mixed with pieces, and the same exact thing is in the gas, so therefore it's min b'minoi the b'mashu v'loy bottle, and the reason why it's not bottle is because even though it's overwhelmed and it's bottle b'shishim, shishim is not bottle, does not be mevatel min b'minoi, And the svara is a different taste will be mevatel a taste, but the same taste, if anything, enhances the taste. But akati tiksha, I still have a problem. Lema salek minoi, the hainu yayin kimisha einoi, visha einoi minoi, the hainu ha'novim shebegas rabel of mevatel. There is a svara whenever you have min b'minoi and visha einoi minoi. So here you have wine and wine, that's min b'minoi. But there's also a whole bunch of grapes in the gas. So let the grapes in the gas be mevatel the yayin that comes from the basket. The hainu shanovim shvagas rabel mevatel kidusfir le'nami l'rava bepergit anosha chatiche shel dak tamei v'yeshloimer the sover le'kabaye, maybe our Gemara holds a kabaye damer chamer chadta be'invi b'mashu. He holds it's one and the same. Fresh wine and grapes. So if it's not fermented wine, it's fresh wine in grapes. Is b'mashu because it's min b'minoi and it's einei bottle. Or maybe there's another possibility of why the little bit of wine in the basket will answer the whole wine in the gas. The mari hachach loy sheish harbe yayin biyachad begas. There's a lot of wine together in the gas that's separate from the grape shells, the grape skins. So that's one thing that we want to be aware of. Is there a bittul of min b'minoi min shebe'eina minoi? Okay. The imtaimer freik toisvis, another interesting kasha. The parish Rebbeinu Tam de mefarish lakamon beperik beis in beperik basra. Soon we're going to run into a Rebbeinu Tam that holds stam yayin nesech b'shishim keshari surim shebetoira im loy noida shenisnasech lavodas kechaf. Even though avodah Zara might be bottled, might not be bottled, even be'elef, but if it's stam yayin, well, you don't know for sure that the guy poured it lavodah Zara. There's just a chash that he poured it lavodah Zara would always be bottled b'shishim, just like any other isser. So if you hold like Rebbeinu Tam, imkein lama yesar hachzaras gergusni. Why should putting the gergusni into the gas? Why should that answer all the wine in the gas? The mistama yeshishim bechartzanei gas mimasha begargusni. There's probably shishim in the gas to be mevatel that little bit that's in the gargusni. Vafilum yisbar kabayi mutter. It should be mutter because of the Rebbeinu Tam shita that stam yain is bottle b'shishim. Yishlomi Rav Rav Rabbi severely. Maybe Rav Huna holds like Rav, who is his Rebbe. Damar Pergit Anosha, the sever like Rabbi Yehuda, v'aymer min b'minay b'mashu b'chol yisurin shebetar. Even though it's treated like every other isser according to the Rebbeinu Tam, but Rav holds that min b'minay is not bottled even by any other isser. Okay, let's have a look at the next shtickle because this also is a big piece of yoyer there. Gargusni gufa b'may mitzvah. The nitzuk, shmami no nitzuk chibur, it seems like a flow connects an upper body of grape juice with the lower body. And timer frektoisis imkain masha begas hoyulonu lesser mitam nitzuk. Once you say nitzuk chibur, and that's why we look at it like the gargusni is connected to the bar. Well, that nitzuk starts all the way up in the gas, and that's flowing down through the basket into the bar. So automatically what's in the gas should be also even without placing the gargusni into the gas. The shiny hacha davenitzuk bar nitzuk. It's not one straight stream. The migas legargusni have a nitzuk echad. First the wine is pouring down from the gas into the strainer, and then umigargusni the bar is nitzuk sheni. So since it's going through two nitzuks, that's not a connection. And therefore, we can, from this halacha here that we just learned, Pasku Harivan, Varashbam, Rabbeinu Tam, B'Shem Rashi. All of these grandchildren of Rashi, Paskin, in his name, they said over from him, Ta'afilu leman damer nitzuk chibur, mikamokim nitzuk bar nitzuk kiyacha einei chibur. They extracted a massive kula. And we're going to see how this became relevant practically. Well, this is also a practical relevance. That nitzuk bar nitzuk is not chibur. Meaning, if it first goes into one place and then it drains down into a second place, the center might be connected to the top and to the bottom, but the top is not connected to the bottom. It's a big chiddush in a kula. Why are you calling this nitzuk bar nitzuk? It's one stream that happens to be passing through a strainer. The chivin shegargusli ostun nekavim im came neufel bevadai minagas labar. It's one stream. It's just going through a strainer. So this is not a nitzuk bar nitzuk. This is one nitzuk. So everything in the gas should be osir. Yishlemis aktoisvis. The kiven the nikvei agargusni einem asum biyosher eliminat stadin im kein lav chad nitzuku. The way this gargusni worked is it didn't have holes on the bottom that allowed the wine to drain out of it. And then you could say it's one flow of wine directly from the gas into the bar. No, the holes on this basket were only on the side. So the nitzuk would come from the gas into this pail and it would fill up. And then out of the sides of the pail, there would be a secondary nitzuk that would go from the pail into the bar. That's why it's not one nitzuk. There's the first nitzuk and then there's a secondary nitzuk. And here's where it became relevant lamaisa. Umaisa ba lefnei Rashi. There was a story, a shaila la'alacha that came to Rashi. Va'oived keichavim sheshafach yayin min hakankan l'kois. A guy poured wine from a jug into a kois. Maybe somebody turned to the guy, not knowing the fellow was a guy, and said, "Could you please pour for me from this jug into my kois?" And the guy poured. When that happens, she'oz neser hayayin shebekois, the wine in the kois now is osir because the guy poured it. Mishum demai did nafik liberoi gazru be'rabanan. This guy didn't do it l'shem avodah Zara. He did it because the Yid asked him to pour wine into the kois for him. But there's a gzeir derabanan that whatever comes out of the jug when the guy pours, no matter why he poured it, there's a gzeir derabanan that whatever came out of the jug now becomes osir al shayines. So all of the wine in the kois is osir, but not the wine that remained in the jug. Kidlakaman beperk beis. But because of that, once the wine in the kois is osir, that is going to go back into the jug. Why? Since the wine in the kois through the flow is connected to the wine in the jug, now everything will become osir. So everything is osir now. The achagach moshach Yisrael yayin min hachaves lakanka, and then the Yid poured wine. He allowed wine to run from the chaves in to this kankan. Now the question is, will that so we have some wine in the kankan that's osir, a little bit of wine left over, and now we're going to add more wine to it from the chavis, good wine, and now that good wine is going to get messed up. So pashas, everything would be osir. Rashi came out with a murdik yichidish l'chula v'tirei Rashi. Rashi says no, that wine that's in the jug you could use. Why? V'nois and tam. How did the wine in the kankan become osir? It only became osir because through the flow it was connected to the wine that was in the kois that was poured. Such a connection is not so chomer. We'll call the yain that's left in the barrel nitzuk bar nitzuk. Why? Because there was never a connection from the wine of the barrel into the kois. The wine in the barrel comes into contact with the wine in the jug, and the wine in the jug only connected to the wine in the kois through nitzuk. So therefore Rashi allowed the wine in the chavetz. Vari Biram, which is the Rivam, he argued on Rashi's kula, and he said there's a chumrah. Kila olam emalach nitzuk bar nitzuk chibur. Maybe nitzuk bar nitzuk is considered one big connection. But if that's the case, in our case, why isn't all of the yain and the gas that's going through the basket, through the strainer into the bar, why isn't it all osir? Because of nitzuk chibur. For a different reason. The masha v'gas ein nikra dayin yayin. Yes, the wine in the gas is touching, connected to the wine in the bar through nitzuk, but it's not wine. So that is the shaila if there's such a thing called nitzuk. But this is a massive shaila lalocha because the Yidden and the Goyim worked together, and there were so many different stories of wine getting mixed with Goyim. So you see Rashi had a major kula, and he relied on nitzuk bar nitzuk to be makel of the wine in the chavis. Yet we see that the Rivam argued on this. And now Tosfos brings another story at the bottom of Tosfos. Ma'aseh bo lifnei Rab Menachem zatzal. Another story came to Rab Menachem. Bechavis shekala hayayin arabarza. So if you have a barrel, they put a spigot in the side of the barrel, but that might not be all the way at the bottom of the barrel. It would be, let's say, 2-3 inches up from the bottom. And what happened was the wine drained down until it was at the barza, which means, you know how it works. If you want to get water out of the chaynik, sometimes you lean it over so that the water level will be higher at the point of the spigot so you can get out of it. And that's exactly what happened. The wine level was too low to get it out of the spigot. And the goy leaned the whole barrel over, and at that point, the Yid opened up the spigot to get wine out of it. So what happened over here? The guy lifted up the entire barrel so that when the Yid lifted the spigot, now wine flowed. But the problem is now the guy lifted up the wine. And Rabbi Nachem, the hitter yayin hanisher b'chavetz, he said that whatever wine flows out, that is going to be usher. Like we said, the wine that flows out when the goy pours is usher. But the wine that remained in the chavis, that Rabbeinu Menachem was matir, the usher also sheyotza l'chutz. But he only asked the wine that came out. The hachi aminan be'asoicher hama'ar mechavis lebor. If someone, a goy, pours from a chavis into a bar, kilu achayotze mechavis ulamata usher. Everything that comes out is usher. And we said that speaking ba'ovid kachavim hama'ara. If a goy pours, whatever comes out of the jar, of the bottle, of the chavis is usher, but whatever remains inside will be mutter. So these are the Yeridei Shalos that were very relevant in the times of the Rishonim when they worked closely together. How the Yisur of Yain Nesach impacted it. There was a little child. The Tana avoidis kachavim b'shish shani. He was such a smart boy that by the time he was 6 years old, he knew Mesechus avoidis kachavim. He knew this Mesechta thoroughly. So somebody wanted to fire him. Boy minay, they asked him the following question: Ma'u lidroich ima oivit kachavim begas. Are you allowed to be doyech, crush grapes together with a goy? Now we already know the Mishnah Chorina forbids it because any yain that comes out of the grape in the gas will be considered yayin, and therefore it will be asher yayin nesach. So you're not allowed to. What did this little yingala say? Amalu darchen, you're allowed to im oivit kachavim begas. Right to Gemara, what about the Mishnah Achrayna? V'ha kamanasech biyadei. The guy is not just stomping on it with his feet, which you might want to say does not answer it, but he's also picking up chunks of the grapes and putting it into the actual press, as we learned. So if that's the case, there's mamish a question of yayin stam over here. And how could you as a child say it's going to be mutter? Zog to Gemara, because nisuch the tzayarnu luliyad. When do I say you're allowed to zog the child? That's only if the goy is handcuffed. So he could not possibly have touched any of the grapes with his hands. He's only touching them with his feet. He's still making yayin nesach with his legs. So weiter, you have a problem. Zok to Gemara. So the child answered, that's not a problem because nisuch to regel lo shmei nisuch. If a guy touches the wine with his hands, that's when we have a concern of stam yayin. But if a guy touched the wine with his feet, there is no concern of stam yayin. Hahu Avoda, there was a story the Havas ben Adah that happened in Adah. What occurred? The Doshu Yisrael v'Oivit Gechavim lahucham. A goy and a yid together were stomping on the wine, and they asked the Shmuel, the Shaila, is this wine going to be mutter or is this wine going to be us? V'shaya Shmuel tulasa ridli. Shmuel waited 3 Yamim Tovim because we know that the Shaila Medarshan, the Hilchas Achag, before Yom Tov and Gedolim and Rabbanim and Poskim come. So Shmuel delayed his psak for 3 Yom Tovim. He wanted to consult and discuss. He didn't want to paskin on. Frank the Gemara, what was the delay? What was Shmuel pondering that he didn't want to paskin right away? My timer. Ilema mishum de kasovar. If you're going to say it's because Shmuel holds the E Mishkachane Tana de Osar. I want to try to find support to say that this will be even Osar Ba'ano. As Rashi says, E Mishkachane Tana de Osar Krab Nosson. Someone, if I can find people, other Tanoim who agree with Rab Nosson, who says Yain Ba'ano B'magoy Shleif Gechavim, the Yain will be Osar, even Ba'ano, if the guy touches it. Even though it's not yayin nesach, it's tam yayin. He merely touched it. The nisach will have an osur bano el de shichshach. Normally, the only time it will be osur bano is if the guy shakes the wine, he splashes around the wine with his hand. That's a ma'aser that could be for a Zara. But stam, if he touched it, there it wouldn't be osur bano. But there is one Tana who holds that it's osur bano. And maybe Shmuel was trying to find consensus to that Tana because he wanted to answer it bahano. The Mishkachan Tana, the Osar Krab Dosen, Oishrinu Afilu Bano. The Tanya we learned, not to do if the wine was being measured, Bein Biyad, Bein Beregel. So a guy was doing a service to the Eid, measuring the level of wine in his barrel. Sai if he used his hand, Sai if he used his foot. Yi mocher, it should be sold, meaning it won't be usher to have enough from. You're allowed to sell it, but it is usher to drink. And Rashi says it's not usher bano because this fellow is not having kavana. The guy is not having kavana to be menasech l'avodah. He's doing his job. He's measuring. From Nosson Omar, it makes a difference. Biyad usher. If he did it with his hand, then it'll be usher even bahano. But beregel mutter. But if he is only using his foot, then it will be mutter. So you see, Rab Nosson said it's osir ba'ano. Is that what Shmuel was trying to find consensus for? That doesn't make sense. Because even Rab Nosson, Eimer Dam Rab Nosson biyad. Rab Nosson only says it's osir ba'ano if the guy was using his hand. But beregel miyomar, and our story is dricha, meaning a guy with a yid together was being doich with their feet wine. So even Rab Nosson holds there's no isur ano there. So that can't be what Shmuel was looking for consensus of. Ella, you know what it must have been? The Mishkachan and Tana de Shari, Kirab Shimon. Shmuel wanted to be mekel and allow this to be mutter, even b'shtia, and he was trying to find consensus to the Tana Rab Shimon, Ishar Yafilu b'shtia. Who is Rab Shimon? Zok Rashi, Rab Shimon, the Shari Maga Shal Oivet Kechavim, Shaloi Niskaven Anasech. Rab Shimon holds any guy that touches wine doesn't have asr. We hold if a guy touches a bottle of wine, it's asr. But Reb Shimon held no. If a guy merely touches wine and he had no kavanah to make nisuk, he doesn't answer it at all. So Shmuel was waiting 3 of them tovim to try to find consensus, to be able to pass the kula, to salvage this wine for this yid. That's why he waited 3 regalim. So let's just have a look at the Tosfos at the bottom of Amud Beis, because Tosfos discusses what makes it yayin nesach and when will it be asur be'achila, when will it be asur b'hano. So let's have a look at this shayla. Ma'u lidroich ima'evit gechavim begas. That was the question that was asked of this 6-year-old. This is the question they asked him, but why didn't they ask him a different question? Ma'u lidroich evit gechavim im Yisrael. So the shayla here was not that the guy was going to be working with the yid on the yid's wine that the yid was going to drink. The shaila merely is a Jew allowed to get a job for a goy and have hanoah from this wine because he's getting paid to assist the goy in his dricha process. So it's mashma shel agash shel ovid kechavim. It's mashma that this wine belonged to the goy. The question was never if it would be mutter to drink. The shaila, are you allowed to get such a job and get paid? We were having enough of this yain. That's what it's mashma, because that was the question. Can a yid work for a goy, not the other way around? Umayri nami b'ditzayer lei liodei. It also has to be speaking where the guy's hands were tied, so he couldn't possibly have been menasach to wine. And this was the question that was asked of this 6-year-old child. If a guy could only access this wine with his feet, would that make it into yayin eser, and therefore would be asur b'ano, and therefore the Jew would not be able to accept such a job, Eloi, or not? And you also have to say, looking at the Bach and I say, Sha'al Yedei Maisa Shaloi, meaning the Bach says what must have happened was Pirish Shabaha Yisrael v'Shaloi Umuter Loi Lechatchila Lidroich. The question was not this had already occurred and now they want to know if it's Asur B'Ano. Rather, the Yid wanted to know, may I take a job working for a goy, Lidroich Ima Ovid Kechavim, and he told the Rav, can I work for a guy and be doyrech yain in his press with him, but his hands will be tied. If he was asking for a psak halacha, he should have said you're not allowed to, because that's what the Mishnah Achrayna says. He must have asked about an occurrence that actually happened. Like Mishnah Achrayna Kedaprecious, and that's how we passed it. Since there's already wine oozing out of the grapes here, have a yain gomer for Mishnah Achrayna. Come to Chayt, according to the Mishnah Achrayna, this is yain gomer, and therefore v'lomo lo yeser yain agas ba'no l'mandamar nitzuk bar nitzuk chibur. If you hold nitzuk bar nitzuk is chibur, everything should be asur al yidei yain habor shu asur ba'no. The yain in the bar of the guy is asur ba'no. So shouldn't that connect to the gas and make everything asur? V'yeshloimer the nitzuk kihai she'eino oivit kechavim nogeya ata b'bar. Nitzuk, in a case like we're discussing, where the guy is not in the bar, the guy is in the gas. All the guy is doing now is stomping on the grapes with his feet. There, loy asru bano. There, they wouldn't have asru it bano, and that's why the Yid would a lot of work there. Darmin come on, yain b'yain yimocher loiv tekachavim. You're allowed to sell it to a guy. Chutz midei yain ashach shabai. Alma, you see, afilu nisar v'legamrei loy ashrin bano. You see, we do not asru it bano. Avoda inoga b'soifa kiluach. But if the guy touched the bottom of the area where the wine is running down, it would be as if he touched the elyon v'asur bana, and all of it would be asur bana. Okay, let's stop here, and as Hashem, we will continue tomorrow. Everybody should have an awesome, awesome day.